ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about art, culture, politics, sport, and anything else worth talking about. If you like this interview, and indeed any other interviews that I've done, can you please like and subscribe to the podcast? Because I'd really like this channel to grow. So thank you very much for that. So today's guest is a boxing writer who's written a book about the four belt era, but the book's called The Four Belt Era, which is a very interesting read. His name is Jose Corpas, and he's here to talk to me now. Hello, Jose.
Chris, thanks for having me on. Um, Big fan of your channel. I just wanted to say a warm welcome to the listeners too, and I hope they continue to tune in.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So let's start off with, before we get into the main crux of what the book is trying to say, just a little bit about yourself and your writing. So obviously, this isn't the first book that you've written. Because I've read another one of your books before. Can you just explain like how you got into boxing and what led you down this path to be a boxing writer?
Oh gosh, it's such a long story. We're going back about 40 years. Um, Older brother, father were into the sport. I guess I just rubbed off on me. My older brother was an amateur, and he entered some pretty good competitions. He actually fought. Do you remember a featherweight named Juan Laporte, who was
Yes, yeah, I remember.
yeah,
Yeah,
he actually fought him in the amateurs. So um, I don't know. I've been in gyms since I was about 7 years old. On and off. Um, One of our neighbors was a guy named Pedro Montanez, who's actually featured in my recent book. He fought Henry Armstrong and Lou Ambers in the 1930s. So he was friends and neighbors with my grandparents. So I've kind of always been around the sport. Tony Gennaro was a friend of our families also, welterweight contender who fought Kid Gavilan. And I tried it out a little bit. Had a couple amateur fights, couple of pro fights. Um, Remember my one of the guys I met coming up was a old welterweight contender named Tony Pallone,
yeah,
and Pallone told me something that never stopped resonating in my head. He asked me, well, he told me he acknowledged when I said I wanted to be a fighter. He says everyone wants to be a fighter, but do you want to be an ex-fighter? Is what he told me. And as I started going around the gyms and started meeting some of the former fighters, I think I got an idea what he was warning me of. And I think that's when I transitioned. I went into the service, took some college courses, was interested in writing, worked on a newspaper for a little while. Unfortunately, didn't pay well enough. So I got a job with the utility company. And then I started freelancing boxing writing. And that's one of my passions was dogs, boxing, and cars. And that's how you got to know me from my boxing writings.
yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. So, what prompted you to write this book? Because it's a brilliant title, The Four Belt Era. What prompted you to write about this? Because in a way, you could initially, I imagine, if someone was to pitch this to me and say, "Would you write a book about this?" It could almost be a fruitless exercise because there's so many belts now, not
Right.
just like the four main sanctioning bodies, but you got little interim titles
Oh,
and
it's
even the
yeah.
sanctioning bodies below that as well. Like, how do you start?
Can't keep track. Yeah, you can't keep track. Why did I write it? I don't know. I think a statement had to be made. Um, I think it's getting. It's listen. I don't know what came first. I don't know if boxing started losing its popularity and they had to create more belts, or if boxing started to lose some of its popularity because there were so many belts. Now, if you talk to boxing fans, um, they don't seem to mind so much as long as they see the good fights. But if you talk to former fans or casual fans, the belt situation is confusing to them, and they're not impressed with the number of belts that everyone's winning. What triggered me more so than anything to write the books because I know a couple of people that vote for the Hall of Fame. I personally don't for the International Boxing Hall of Fame. and they're beginning to use belts as one of the primary criteria for deciding who they vote for or not. And that puts fighters pre four belt era in a big disadvantage because they didn't have belts back then. So there's a very popular question among historians is like, oh, he would have been a champ if he fought today. He would have been a champ if he fought today. So I kind of reversed that and I said, well, let's see how it would have looked if we always had four belts. And I went back to the earliest rankings that we could find. Use Ring Magazine, Police Gazette, whatever I could find, anything that looked like a top 10. And I gave four belts out to everyone, and then I just followed their careers. Whoever they lost to will become the new champ, or if they retired, I tried my best to crown a new champ amongst the leading contenders, so long as they weren't coming off a loss. And I tell you, the book would have been as tall as you and me if I included everyone who won a belt.
Mhm.
But I try to make the book like a snapshot of what it might look like. And yeah, it might be a fruitless exercise. I don't know. It might fall on deaf ears, but I think it was an opportunity for me to paint the picture of A, how ridiculous it looks with this number of belts and how ridiculous history would look, and B, put the fighters of the past on an even playing field with the fighters of today if we're gonna so that we have more of an apples to apples comparison.
Okay. So one of the things I have noticed in this modern era, as much as the four belts are an annoyance, is there seems to be a move towards more boxers actually wanting to claim all four belts and actually keep hold of them for a long time. So, for example, you've got people like Usyk at heavyweight. You've got the situation like heavyweight between Bivol and Beterbiev, and they're swapping each four belts between each other. And Nuai, I think, has done it twice. Taylor Crawford as well. Canelo. Would you agree with me that as much as you would rather have one champion in each way, there seems to be a bit more of a move from boxers' mindset to actually wanting to collect the belts, whereas before that there was never the case.
I don't know if it was never been the case. I think that the champ always sought out the top leading contenders. Now, it didn't always happen. Like, for example, Floyd Patterson avoided Sonny Liston for a while. Way back, Jack Dempsey drew the color line, so we never saw Jack Dempsey versus Harry Wales. So boxing's always suffered from poor enforcement of rules. But if we look at when boxing was at its heyday, and by heyday, I'm going about by the number of fighters, the number of fighters is shrinking in any country. If you go by what you see on TV, you might not notice it, but the club fights are gone. Fighters are fighting less frequently, and there's less fighters. So if we go back to boxing's heyday, when it was at its in the mainstream, at least in America, we didn't need the belts, right? You know, it was a big deal to be the number one contender or to be the number five contender. The belts is just putting a label on the fights now, and the reason they're doing it is because television pays more for belts and sponsors pay more for belts. And it might be an unfortunate reality that you can't sell a fight unless you have a belt on it. But in the past, that wasn't the case. Ali ran the table, fought everyone in the top 10 in both the 60s and the 70s, for example. Emil Griffith did the same thing, Carlos Monzon. So I don't know that that statement is accurate. I think that the best sought to fight the best and they sought to make the most money whenever they could, for the most part. There's exceptions to every rule, though.
Yeah.
I don't blame the fighters, though, Chris. I don't. The fighters have to do what they have to do.
Hmm.
When I hear commentators saying or the zone writing that, like Max Kellerman recently said, "Oh, Terence Crawford is doing something that even Henry Armstrong didn't do." Well, yeah, because Henry Armstrong fought at a time when there were 8 divisions and one belt, right? Had Henry Armstrong fought in a day like today, yeah, exactly. So the comparison, I think they're doing history a disservice at the sake of trying whatever they can to sell today's fights.
Yeah, indeed, I agree with you on that. So when did the four belts begin? Well, in fact, let's go back even further. When did the two belts begin? because obviously you had the WBO and IBF didn't exist
Right.
80. So when did the WBA and WBC start, and why did they start?
Yeah. So generally, boxing's always been kind of splintered, but there seemed to be a universal consensus on who was the champ, regardless of what was being recognized by the various state commissions. So if we go back to the 1920 when the Walker Law popularized, legalized boxing in New York, and when Madison Square Garden was built, that's when New York became the hub, and the New York State Athletic Commission began recognizing the champs, and they were doing a pretty decent job. But the other states, 14 other states, decided basically like who died and made the New York State Athletic Commission boss. So 14 states banded together a couple of years later and formed what was called the National Boxing Association.
Mhm.
Right now, in the 60s, the New York State Athletic Commission kind of stopped recognizing boxing fights. So the National Boxing Association was really the only one that was doing it. Occasionally, California might recognize someone, Maryland might recognize someone. Out in the UK, you had a few instances where the IBU was recognizing champs before they became the European Boxing Union. So, for example, in the 1920s, they actually recognized Panama Al Brown as featherweight champ. And I mentioned Al Brown because I wrote a book about him, my biography on him. So they were always, Australia had, there were always pockets of other organizations that would recognize world champions. But there seemed to be a universal um, acknowledgement of who really was the champ. Then the NBA had their elections, and they became the World Boxing Association around 1962. And one of their elections, um, some people were not happy with the way the elections were conducted. So they branched off under the Mexican president. I think his name was Obregón at the time. They formed the WBC, right, around 63. The WBC, excuse me, wasn't too popular until the mid 70s when they recognized Larry Holmes as the heavyweight champion. Ali got beat by Leon Spinks. So that's really when the two-headed monster started coming out. Now, you may look at some historians, I see them and I cringe when I see it because they'll talk about Carlos Ortiz fought for the WBC title against Douglas Vaillant. No, that's not how it happened. And all you got to do is look at the news reports and the posters. There was no mention of a WBC title. What happened was the WBC chose to recognize Carlos Ortiz as champ, and that happened to be the first fight. But they didn't choose. They chose Ortiz because he was already the universally recognized champ. So it wasn't like fighters were seeking the WBC belt. Some did in Mexico, especially the bantamweights, because it's a belt. Then fighters want some sort of recognition. The world started getting big too, so it started getting too big for one belt. A lot of countries were being left out, and that's part of the reason why Latin America they formed a voting bloc. So they exploited a chink in the WBA's voting process, where the WBA had a certain amount of delegates per state. So Latin America said, okay, well, we have states in our countries too. So they banded together, backed one candidate, and that's where the WBA moved from Chicago down to Panama. And it's been back and forth between Panama and Venezuela. Um, then in the 1980s, when um, Robert Lee and Don Elbaum, and I got this right from Don Elbaum, they saw that the WBC was recognized. So in the late 70s, two things happened. Number one, Don King tried to revitalize the American Championship with Ring Magazine. Did you hear about that, Chris?
The Ring Magazine Championship. No, I didn't hear about. Was that the
Yeah,
heavyweight tournament? Is that what you're talking about?
no, well, they were doing it in a couple of divisions. So they had the American Championships, which was popular in the 1920s,
Okay.
where Gene Tunney and Harry Greb were fighting for that. So Don King wanted to revitalize that because in the 1970s, it was mostly foreign champions. Other than heavyweight, it was
Mm.
basically Bob fought, right? And then Monzon, Napoles, Duran, Arguello, Olivares, right? They were all from Latin America or Europe. Um, So he tried to revitalize the American Championship. Unfortunately, he couldn't help himself, and it became scandal ridden. And only fighters that were under Patty Flood, for example, were getting in. So Marvin Hagler wasn't included, for example, right? And he was the top middleweight at the time. So that became the Ring magazine scandal. They had fake records. ABC was involved. They pulled their recognition and their backing from that tournament. Um, Ring magazine almost shut down after that. So that's when Don King started latching onto the WBC, and he got them to crown Ken Norton champion without even fighting, right? So when a couple years later in the '80s, out in New Jersey, Don Elbaum and Robert Lee said, "Hey, listen, Robert Lee, according to Don Elbaum, Robert Lee was supposed to win the presidency for the WBA. He was supposed to win the election. Now, how you know someone's going to win an election, I don't know, right? Right, but when he didn't win and it stayed in Central America, they said, let's do what the WBC did. We form our own organization. So they formed the IBF, which originally was called the USBA International. And 2 years after that, 3 years after that, a group of businessmen from Dominican Republic and Puerto Rican, same thing. They had an issue with the way the WBA held their elections because it seems like no one could win, right? In the WBA election, well, for the presidency, I'm talking about. So they branched off. They formed the WBO around 1988. So most of the organizations came out because they didn't trust the WBA's elections for the presidency. And then the media just started following them. I happened to be in the gym when Doug DeWitt, middleweight from the '80s, he came in with the WBO belt, the WBO belt, World Boxing Organization, and people were asking him, "What is that? What is that?" We didn't know what it was, right? We heard the initials, but we really didn't know what it was. But then we started seeing Doug DeWitt, Regilio Tour, and they started making more money from it. And then people say, you know what? I want it looks nice, and you get paid more, and people call you champ. I want it too. So I don't blame the fighters for going after it. But there was a time when promoters could promote without having to have all of these designations and jewelry and all this extra titles attached to it.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about WBO because so when I was 9 years old, the first fight I'd watched was the first fight between Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn, and that
Okay,
was for the WBO title. And the
right.
WBO title, especially in the 90s, it seemed a lot more popular in Europe than it did
Yes, it
say
was
in America. It was almost
in the
in
early '90s. Yeah,
um, yeah, and it wasn't until like I would say the mid 2000s really where it started to become a little bit more prominent. I think
yeah.
De La Hoya won it at middleweight and they said I was a six-time world champion, and around about then where you thought, oh, okay, now it's a bit more relevant as well. But it also leads me on to another thing, and it's not just WBO. What's the most egregious? It's a long list, but what's the most egregious thing every governing body has done? So, for example, another WBO, they had a guy in there, I can't remember which division it was in one of the rankings, who was in the top 10, but he died a few years ago.
The WBA did the same thing
Did the same thing, gosh.
twice. They rated a dead guy. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. Listen, listen. They're raking Jake Paul. Some people might say that that's inappropriate. I'm not sure Jake Paul's fights are real. Some of them might have been, but not against the boxers he's fighting. For example, I don't.
Mm.
I'm not convinced that the Tyson, Javante Davis, and him. Um, I look at it as almost like a wrestling show. Some people might say that's egregious. The first thing that comes to my mind is when a German fighter named Graziano Rocchigiani sued the WBC,
Mhm.
and that was very. I don't remember the details at the moment, but they basically took the belt from him to give it to Roy Jones, I believe it was, because Roy Jones had a bigger name or something. I don't remember what it was, and he sued, and they were about to go bankrupt. And I forgot they settled out of court. But whatever it was that the courts found there was enough for them to bring them to their knees. And for a while, it looked like there was going to be no WBC. So that's I mean, like you said, it's a long list of egregious things. It's almost listen. I'm not anti-organization. I actually happen to know quite a few that work there, and I think that most of them have their heart in the right place. I've seen what they've done for charities. I've seen them pay fighters' rents. I've seen them pay medical bills. But WBC right now is taking care of Pritchard Cologne, for example. So I don't. I just think that their number one interest is not the sport. Their number one interest is their own sanctioning body, and then the sports comes to number two. So I don't think that they are reliable to look towards as determining who really is the champion of the world, who really are the best fighters. I think that's what I thought. But I went back into history though, and I said, you know what? Everyone loves four belts. Okay, let's keep them, but let's backdate it. Now we got a whole bunch of. I don't know if you saw that section. How many British fighters now would have been chance? Forget the WBO putting a spotlight on them. You would have had guys like Nell Talton, um, way back. Dom Vellante, Jock McAvoy. You would have had so many champions. It would have opened the door. But the funny thing, Chris, is that they're the same fighters though, but we're just calling them champions. So it has a
Yeah,
better ring to it. So but that's all I did was I'm not asking for them to disappear, right? I think they do good, they do bad, they dig their own grave. I'm not really pointing fingers at them. But what I don't like is when these experts like Max Kellerman say, "Oh, this guy's doing something Henry Armstrong didn't do." Well, there's a huge asterisk that you got to attach to that, right? So that's really what triggered the book was try to level the playing fields, and then for the fighters of the past, so we could get an idea of just how good somebody like Peter Kane really was, right? Just how good someone like Henry Cooper really was. Henry Cooper ends up with multiple titles, and let's not forget he was barely 190 pounds, right? He was forced to fight as a heavyweight. We've been a perfect fighter for cruiserweight, for example, right? So that was the purpose of my book. So I'm not bashing the belts too much. I do think it's a mistake. Just like we can't have you have the 286 Project podcast.
yeah, yeah,
You can't have four with the same name.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So we can't really have four champions. It goes against the definition of the word. I mean,
yeah. I
well,
think Thomas Hauser put it best where he says having four sanctioning bodies would be like having four kings of England. It just wouldn't make any sense at all.
it, that is funny. And I even asked. Well, I'm not going to say the name, but someone from the IBF questioned the book and questioned why it's such a big problem to have four different champs, right? Right. And I said, well, it's not really a big problem. It's just why if it's okay to have four champs in each division, then why not have four presidents of the IBF? Right. And he didn't have a good reply to that though. He thought I was being a little bit facetious, but I'm really not though. It's the same thing. It,
Mm.
there, there used to be a time when calling them contenders was perfectly fine. Now it's almost like an insult to call someone a contender with so many champions coming around.
Well,
And
how
then
much?
if you,
Uh,
I was going to add one more thought about why I also titled it the era
yeah, yeah.
because because winning a belt or being called a champion, there's this it insinuates someone beat a top-notch fighter to become a champ, but that hasn't always been the case, right? So we've had fighters who have won belts that probably weren't even in the top 10. And we can look now at the heavyweight picture. I think there's like six champs now at the heavyweight picture, according to the sanctioning bodies. We all look at Usyk, right? But
Mhm.
I think Kubrat Pulev just won the WBA belt, right? I don't even know if
Yeah,
Kubrat, he's not really a top
it's a
10
high
heavyweight. Yeah,
basic.
exactly. But he's a champion by today's definition. So I think that's also an error too, is when we call in champions um, not every rock in the street should be treated like a diamond. The diamonds should be precious, right? And you can't have now you're calling everyone a diamond. Everyone wants to get paid like a diamond, and that's another problem that trickles down because now we're overpaying contenders because we have to pay them like champions. So
Mhm.
now we have to sell the tickets at a higher price, and that's why so many more fights are on pay-per-view because everyone's a champion now, and that so there are ramifications and consequences by calling everyone a champion.
Yeah, yeah, there sure is. And I was just thinking actually, when you first told me about the title of your book, the one division I was thinking of in the one era was the 1970s, the middleweights,
Right?
because there was so many boxers around us, especially around
Yes.
Philadelphia, like Benny
Yes.
Briscoe and you just Hart and whatnot, who
Yeah.
would have been world champions under this current system.
Correct. Almost all of them.
Yeah,
Yeah, almost all of them. Eugene Hart, Willie Monroe, Bobby Watts. Yeah, almost all of them would have been. And I was conservative with the amount of interims and regulars and supers, right? Because if I gave out as many as they're actually giving out now, basically everyone in the top seven is going to come home with a belt, right? So no, I was conservative with it. Yeah,
yeah, indeed. It's it's a mind blowing list. It's a
it
mind
is.
blowing list. And
Right.
it's like where can you where, where would I mean how would like I said at the start, how would you begin to do something like that? Because it's like the amount of research you must have had to do for this book. It must have been even more for Winnie the Panama Al Brown because you have to go through so many fight records to.
Yeah, you got to go through the records. One good place to start is the champs, right? And then see who they fought. There weren't rankings all the way from the beginning, but you could get an idea who was in the top 10 by um, the amount of champions and contenders that they were fighting, right? And then for certain areas, I kind of had to make my own top 10, sort of, right? And then after that, it was just a matter of following their records. So it's just a lot of clicking on Boxing Rec, um, just following their records. So it's time consuming. It wasn't like rocket science type of research though, but it was tedious. And I went through two notepads worth of notes, those the spiral books, like
Mhm.
360 pages. I went through two of those completely. One of these days, I don't know if I'm going to release the list on a website or I might just make like a podcast series or something, releasing the entire list so that everyone can see. But I tell you, it's exhausting. The book would have been like 1,000 pages if I included everyone.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, with television being as powerful as it is within the sport of boxing, if they have actually the power to end a lot of this nonsense. Because even back in the 90s, if say HBO and Showtime back in the 90s said, we don't want these four bouts, we just want try and do one bout, would that have been beneficial? Or actually, because of TV's power, would that have caused a lot more problems? I.e., two fight, two best fighters in the division, one say HBO, one Showtime, trying to get them together to fight for a title. Do you understand what I mean?
Mm, I don't know. I don't know what I can only imagine that it would have been the way it was in the 1960s, right? In the 1950s, we could use that as an example. Um, TV does have the power to do it, and we're kind of getting glimpses with the way Turkey Alashiki and TKO and Dana White are speaking. They almost sound like they would rather do away with the organizations, right? So it's going to be hard to do, right? Because they can't possibly take care of all the fighters. So there's always going to be a group that's going to siphon off and follow the belts. But Turkey was able to put on some fights without announcing the championship, like the heavyweights, for example. Right? They had Deontay Wilder, Joseph Parker, Zhilei Zhang, and for a while they weren't called champions. Now I think all of them have an interim belt of some sort, but it can be done, right? I think the fans gravitate towards good fights, and the I think it probably might even be easy to get the fights made then. Um, yeah. So to answer your question, I think TV did at one time have the power. Um, they weren't universal in their way of thoughts, though. So it's like one TV will do one thing, and then the other broadcaster will do something else, right? But if everyone came down on the same page, Yeah, the sport will survive. Yep.
Yeah,
You know what you'd probably have to do? You'd have to bring back the regional titles, though. Give those a little bit more prominence. Yeah. In England they have like the Midlands, the Southern area, and the British Empire, not Commonwealth,
yeah,
British
yeah,
Empire, and then where it's almost like a ladder. And if they could do that in the United States, for example, where you could get a state title, a regional belt, a national belt, and then you could start fighting international fighters. It was working fine for the most part. A couple of managers kind of held the title hostage, though, right? But that comes to the blame. There is not the system; it's who's run the system. So if you have weak commissions, then no one's enforcing the rules, and that's where the problem really comes out. If you have people enforcing the rules, then you wouldn't have Tank Davis avoiding Lamont Roach in a rematch,
mm,
right? Or he would forfeit his belt if he did, but like Conte becoming a champ, and then Lamont Roach would get the title fighting someone else. So it all comes down, I think, enforcement more so than the promoters. Right now, there is no enforcement in boxing. There's a couple rules. They make sure the rules are followed, health rules mostly. And then if a disaster strikes, they all work together to see who gets the blame. But there's really nobody who has to say. It's not like the major leagues in baseball where it's the top teams go to the playoffs. In boxing, you could refuse to fight certain fighters, right? Because there's no enforcement.
mm. Interesting you talked about there about the regional belts because in the UK, for as long as I remember, yes, people love a world title fight. We have a lateral progression through to like challenging
Correct.
for a world title fight. So you got from say area to British to sometimes a Commonwealth and then European and then world
Right.
titles.
Yeah.
In the States, that hasn't really been the case. Although in the 70s, there seemed to be a lot of fighters fighting for was it the NABF title?
Yes.
Um,
So
but
we had the USBA title,
yeah, yeah,
and then the NABF title included Canada and Mexico. That
okay.
was the North American title.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why is that the case? Because I know over in the UK, for instance, we had George Groves and James Segal, for instance, fighting for a British title. We had
Yeah.
Anthony Joshua and Dillian White fighting for a British title very young in their careers, and these were like, especially White Joshua, that was a fight which sold out the O2 in London. Whereas in America, that's never really, even against big prospects, never really taken off. Why has that been the case?
Well, it used to be the case. It used to be popular, the regional belts. Like I mentioned before, they used to have the American championships, right? So that was always the USBA, NABF was always like the step before winning the or fighting for the world title, right? It was a very important step. Um, why bother now? Why fight for a USBA belt when there's so many titles going around? Why risk your ranking against a contender for or what will be called a nominal belt when you could just sit around and hope to land one of the other so-called world titles? That's what's becoming a problem now.
Mm,
And TV, why would TV put on a fight between two non-champs when there's so many belts around? Just think about it from a TV executive point of view. Well, TV's absent now in the United States anyway, right? That's not even a fact anymore. Although Top Rank just signed with Stars, the cable network. Let's see how that goes. But um, there's there's um, there's so much to risk fighting for a regional belt now that no one's doing it. They're just standing by, fighting the easy wins, getting the nice, pretty record, and then hoping to land one of the many title fights. That's the formula nowadays.
yeah, it seems a shame because again in UK you have people who are like domestic level fighters, and you don't think they might get a European title, but they're not going to get any more. But they're still very popular because I think one, they're very popular within their own where they live, and also especially on undercards, promoters will put them on over here because especially if they're exciting because you know they're going to get bums on seats. But again, You probably get that a little bit in the States with certain journeymen, like was it Gabriel Rosario, like very exciting fighter, for instance, those sorts of fighters, Darnell Boone. But like I say, you don't get like what you call ex promoting a social regional fights, even if it's just on undercards. And maybe it's me, I'm a traditionalist, but it just seems a shame.
No, it's disappearing. They used to have, you know, even ESPN used to have their tournament. They used to have the ESPN tournament, right?
Hmm.
And they started out as six rounders, and then they ended in tens. That's where Frankie Animal Fletcher became a contender, for example. Out in California at the Inglewood Forum, they had the Strohs Championship, right? It's like $50,000 in the top 10 ranking to the winner, right? So they used to have them. We used to have rivalries. We used to have Bronx versus Brooklyn, right? It used to be Irish versus Italian, Puerto Rican versus Mexico. They used to have all those rivalries. They were able to promote a lot more creatively back then than now. Now they just want a title and a ranking. That's all they want now. That's what they how they want about. I worked for a promoter briefly in the 1980s, and that was back before internet. And we were designing the poster of that's how you sold a fight back then, a local fight with no TV. You had the fight poster, and you used to put them on lampposts, used to put them on corner stores. And the way he sold the fight was he needed I remember one particular time he was looking at the poster and he said, no, I need a ball guy. I need a ball guy for the poster, right? So we had to find a ball fighter to put on the poster. No one knew who he was, but he looked good on the poster. And then when we were selling a fight in Jersey one time, was a lot of Spanish people. He said he wanted a Spanish fighter. He said, give me a Puerto Rican fighter. And then someone mentioned some guy who happened to be Mexican, right? I said, well, he's Mexican, not Puerto Rican. He said, I don't care. His name is Rivera. I want the name Rivera on the poster. So they were a lot more creative ways of selling. Now, the way you build up a fighter, and I speak to some promoters, I speak to managers. They want your fighter to get to 10-0 or 12-0, and then they'll start maybe backing them. So for those first 10, 12 fights, the manager has to pay his own fighter and he has to pay the promoter. They got to buy a block of tickets and sell a block of tickets, right? And the manager has to pay for his fighter and the opponent's fighter and the opponent's medical and the opponent's room and board. So the promoter, I don't know what the promoter's doing other than just packaging it together and selling it to TV. That's what it seems like. But it's changed a lot in the last 40 years, the way you promote it.
Cool. Absolutely, absolutely. Just quickly then, before we go, obviously is this the second book that you've written, or is this you've written more
Number
than that?
three,
Three.
three.
Is this your third?
Yeah.
So what's the plan now? Do you have a plan in mind for your next book, or what's the plan in regards to that?
I got one coming out maybe in September or October. It's the history of boxing in Latin America, and I
Okay.
go back. I go back to the pioneers. Um, people seem to think like people seem to think that boxing started in countries when the first champion was crowned, right? But no, they've had going way back to the days of Louis Firpo, right? They've had contenders. It wasn't thriving, but they had a scene, and there's a lot of fighters that seem to have been forgotten, like Kit Charol from Cuba, Charol, right? That's who Kid Chocolate grew up watching, right?
Hmm.
And so there were favorites, there were ticket sellers. Baby Casanova, Chango Casanova in Mexico. This is a guy who's fighting in front of 40,000 people, right? Regularly in Mexico, right? So it goes back to my era when that goes back to my book. There used to be a time when you could make a good living and the promoter could promote you and the fans would adore you whether you were champion or not, right?
Hmm.
Because the championship was like being an astronaut, right? It's like so rare. Like, do you even know any astronauts personally? No, right? Probably not, right? But you know champions, right? How many champions you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna I was just with one about 3 hours ago, and tomorrow they're doing a benefit for Iran Barkley, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to be in a room with about 10 tomorrow, right?
Oof.
Now, if we were doing this benefit in the '60s, there might only be one champion. That's how rare it was, and that's why at one time the heavyweight title was considered in America to be the most prestigious title in all of sports because it was
Mhm.
the hardest one to get. Now we have at the moment. I think did Moses Itama, does he have a minor belt?
No, well, he's high in the rankings, but he doesn't have a minor belt at the moment.
Joe
Josie Parker,
Joyce,
I think, does interim.
Joseph Parker,
Yeah.
Ajit Caballero, I think has one.
Yeah, WBC interim, yeah.
Um, Kubrat,
Yes, WBA regular, I
and
think it is. So
yeah,
many.
exactly. That's my point. Yeah. So it's not what it used to be. It's not. It's unfortunate. They cheapen what a champ is. They've made the lives a little bit better for, on at least appearance wise, for contenders for some, but it is what it is now. Like I said, listen, whatever it takes to promote fights, if that's what they have to do, I'm all for it. But when the historians hold against somebody from the past the fact that they didn't win a belt, that's that's what I don't like, because that's like saying you can't. They didn't exist back then. You can't hold it against them that they didn't win something that didn't exist.
Mhm.
And I see the Zone, Showtime. They used to the first guy to do this, the first guy to do that. Well, not really, right? It's just we don't know. It's like the 3 point in the NBA that just started. Like, when did it start? 1981 or whatever. So you can't say someone from the '70s, oh, he wasn't that good. He never scored a 3 pointer. Yeah, it didn't exist back then,
Mhm.
right? So I did this book. I don't know what to make out of it. It's I'm not expecting to change anyone's opinions or anything, but I think did you get to see the section where I compare the champions, like which fighters would have had how many title fights and everything? Had there been four belts back then?
I did, but I imagine with a lot of people, it would have been. I mean, take the 80s heavyweight scene, for instance. I imagine, obviously, Holmes, although he never won all the belts, I don't believe, or the two belts on offer, the boxers below him, the round robin of world title fights would have been endless. So I can imagine, yeah, I can imagine it would have been a
So
lot.
like Harry Greb ends up with over 150 title defenses. Right? Sugar Ray Robinson with over 100, exactly. Sam Langford 9 divisional titles, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's wild. So that's what they're doing now. Where they got all these belts they want to give to everyone, and that's good. It's an accomplishment. You beat the belt, most likely you beat a good fighter, right? But
Mhm.
Pacquiao is not the first to win 8, right? If we go back in history, there's about 3 or 4. Still exclusive company, but very different from saying he's the first. Saying you're the first of something insinuates others tried and couldn't do it, right? But in reality, they just wasn't those opportunities back then because they didn't exist. So someone like Sam Langford, Mickey Walker, Jimmy McLaurin, they would have duplicated it. Or even out in your neck of the woods, Len Harvey. Len Harvey's a guy who was ranked from lightweight up to heavyweight. So it's yeah, it would have been very different.
Yeah, indeed. If people want to find out more about your work, where can they go?
Um, you can find my stuff on Amazon. I don't. I should probably be more active on Twitter. I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I think it's one of the greatest things, but at the same time, I think it's used incorrectly a lot of times. And I should probably build up my presence up there. But right now, for now, it's just Twitter at Corpus Writer. I'll try to be more exciting on my social media if more people follow me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. Well, thank you. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I can imagine reading a book, and I mean it's in a good way, could probably make some people's heads spin because there's so many
Yeah.
people, there, so many
Oh,
titles.
it's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
yeah,
you can imagine. Yeah.
but thank you so much for coming on to the 286 Project
Chris,
podcast.
it's a pleasure. Anytime.